When I opened the bedroom door that morning and saw him standing there, right in the doorway with my husband's travel bag still resting by the stairs, I felt something shift in the air. My father-in-law shouldn't have been there. Not at that hour. Not in that part of the house. And definitely not looking at me the way he did. He said he needed help finding his blood pressure monitor, that he'd lost track of it after my husband left for his trip. I believed him. I had to. But when I leaned over to check the drawer, I felt the weight of his gaze on the back of my neck, soft but present. Not threatening. Just human. And in that moment, I realized something that frightened me more than his presence in my room. He was the only man who had looked at me like that in years. I told myself it was nothing, that it would pass, that I'd forget it the moment the kettle boiled and the day got going. But I didn't. Because what happened after that moment, and every quiet second that followed, built up into a choice. A dangerous, impossible choice. And before I share with you what truly happened, before I peel back the layers of silence I've carefully kept for months, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from? And do you have a secret you thought you'd buried so well, only for it to start clawing its way back up to the surface? When you've been married for as long as I have, time becomes a quiet enemy. It doesn't scream or rage, it just wears down the edges of things. What used to feel like love slowly becomes routine. Affection becomes habit. And silence, well, silence becomes normal. My husband left that morning like he always did, lugging his suitcase out the door before sunrise, his lips brushing against my temple in a gesture that had long since lost its warmth. I didn't expect more. I hadn't in years. I stayed in the kitchen a few extra minutes after he drove off, listening to the hum of the fridge and the slow drip of the faucet. The air was still, like the house was holding its breath. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat at the table, and waited for the sounds I knew would follow, his father waking up upstairs, making his way down with those soft, deliberate steps. Ever since my mother-in-law passed away, he'd been living with us. It started as something temporary, something we all agreed on during the funeral. He was too fragile to be alone, we said. The grief had hollowed him out. And it made sense. We had the space. He needed the company. What none of us anticipated was how that arrangement would stretch, month after month, until we all stopped talking about it like a temporary fix and started acting like it was permanent. He was quiet, polite, and never overstepped. Always folded his laundry, always asked before touching anything that wasn't his. He even started setting the table in the mornings when he knew my husband would be gone, just 2 plates, 2 mugs, 1 tiny jar of jam he brought with him from the old house. That morning was no different. I heard him before I saw him, the faint rustle of his slippers on the hardwood, the pause outside the kitchen doorway. "Morning," he said, his voice still hoarse from sleep. I looked up and nodded, offering a tight smile. "Coffee?" He gestured toward the pot. "Smells like you already beat me to it." We didn't talk much after that. We never really did. But there was something oddly comforting about sharing that early space with him. He wasn't looking at his phone, wasn't rushing to check his emails, wasn't lost in numbers and deadlines like my husband always was. He was just there. Present. Drinking his coffee slowly and staring out the window like he had all the time in the world. I remember thinking how odd it was, the way absence makes space. With my husband gone, the air in the house felt lighter, less hurried, less filled with the need to perform normalcy. We were just 2 people drinking coffee in a kitchen that suddenly felt too quiet. I finished my cup and stood to rinse it, and that's when he spoke again. "She used to sit like that," he said softly. I turned. "Sit like what?" He pointed at the chair I'd just left. One leg tucked under, holding the cup with both hands. Said it kept her warm. There was no sadness in his voice, just observation. Memory. I nodded, unsure what to say. I didn't know her well. She'd already been sick by the time we met. Most of what I knew came from stories, and those stories came mostly from my husband, who rarely lingered on emotions. She was a quiet woman, I said eventually, wiping my hands on a towel. She was, he agreed. But she noticed everything. I didn't respond. The kettle started whistling again. I had forgotten to turn off the stove. I reached to do so, then excused myself to go upstairs and get dressed. In the bedroom, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked tired. Not old exactly, but faded. My robe hung loosely over my shoulders, and my hair was pulled back in the way I always wore it when no one was looking. Except someone was looking now. Someone had noticed how I sat, how I held a cup, how I moved through a morning. I told myself it was just grief speaking through him, that he was mistaking old memories for new ones. But I also knew better. I'd seen it. That flicker in his eyes. That softness. It wasn't lust, not yet. It was something more dangerous, attention. I went through my closet, almost on autopilot, and paused over a simple blouse I hadn't worn in years. My husband used to say it brought out my eyes. I'd stopped wearing it when the compliments stopped. But that morning, I put it on. I didn't know why. Or maybe I did. The rest of the day passed slowly. My husband called around noon to say his meeting had been pushed back, and he'd probably be staying overnight. I told him that was fine. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. That evening, as I moved around the kitchen preparing dinner, I caught him, my father-in-law, watching me from the doorway again. His arms were crossed, and he didn't speak right away. Just stood there. "You look different today," he said finally. I turned toward him. "Different how?" He shrugged. "Lighter." I didn't know what to say to that. So I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the silence that followed felt too heavy to bear. We didn't eat together that night. He said he wasn't hungry. I brought a plate up to his room anyway, left it outside the door. As I walked away, I heard the door creak open behind me. I didn't turn back. But I didn't keep walking either. I stood there, one hand on the railing, frozen in that space between duty and desire, between what I knew and what I feared I was beginning to want. That was the first day I allowed myself to wonder, what if this silence we shared wasn't grief at all? What if it was something else entirely? The next morning began like any other, but everything felt slightly displaced. The kettle hissed, the clock ticked in its usual rhythm, and yet something had shifted in the air between us, an invisible presence trailing behind every gesture, every glance. My husband had left early again. I didn't hear the car leave, I only noticed the silence after. That silence used to feel neutral. Now it felt loaded, aware. I stayed in bed longer than I should have. I listened to the sound of water moving through the pipes as he, my father-in-law, showered in the guest bathroom. I imagined the towel hanging loosely over his shoulder, the way he might dry his hands slowly, thoughtfully. And then I shook the thought out of my head like it was a drop of water I could simply fling away. Still, I lingered. The morning light pushed through the curtains in slow, golden ribbons. I was still in my robe when I heard the knock at the door, soft, hesitant. I opened it without thinking. He stood there, holding his reading glasses in one hand and a small device in the other. "Do you know where the batteries are?" he asked, raising the blood pressure monitor slightly. I blinked. The question was so mundane, so ordinary, and yet he was in the threshold of my bedroom. I nodded and turned toward the drawer in my nightstand. As I bent forward to open it, I felt the space between us shrink, felt his eyes on the back of my neck again. I found the batteries quickly enough, but when I turned to hand them over, our fingers touched, briefly, but with the kind of electricity that only comes when you're pretending something isn't there. He didn't pull away immediately, and neither did I. We both stood there, still, suspended. Then I handed him the batteries, turned, and walked past him into the hallway without a word. I heard his footsteps follow me slowly down the stairs, and then he returned to the kitchen while I disappeared into the bathroom. I splashed cold water on my face until my skin tingled. Looking in the mirror, I felt like I was looking at someone else entirely. Someone less sure. Someone more alert. I got dressed quickly and made my way to the kitchen. He was already there, seated at the table, the monitor resting beside his coffee cup. He didn't look up when I entered, but I felt his awareness like a weight in the room. "I found the batteries," he said, as if we hadn't just exchanged something else entirely upstairs. I nodded and poured my coffee. We sat in silence again, the kind that no longer felt casual. He adjusted the strap around his arm and began taking his blood pressure. I watched the numbers rise and fall. His hands were steady. Mine weren't. He looked up and gave a half-smile. "It's better this morning." I sipped my coffee and avoided his gaze. "That's good." Later that afternoon, I tried to distract myself with tasks. I cleaned the upstairs bathroom, reorganized the linen closet, and wiped down surfaces that didn't need wiping. But every time I paused, every time I stopped moving, my thoughts slipped back to that moment in the doorway. It wasn't about desire. Not yet. It was about being seen. That evening, as the sky shifted into soft pinks and purples, I found myself in the living room, folding laundry that had already been folded. He walked in, slower than usual, holding a wine bottle. It was the kind my husband rarely drank, the kind with an old cork and faded label. "I thought maybe we could have a glass," he said. There was no expectation in his voice, just the offer. I nodded. "Sure." We sat across from each other on the couch, an old jazz record playing softly in the background. The first sip hit warm and bitter on my tongue. I let it settle before speaking. "How are you really doing?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He looked down at the rim of his glass, tracing it with his thumb. "Some days, I forget she's gone," he said finally. "I still wake up expecting her to be in the kitchen. Then I come downstairs and see your face. And I'm reminded." I didn't know what to say to that. The honesty of it unsettled me. I looked away, down at the soft folds of a towel in my lap, at the glass in my hand. "I remind you of her?" He nodded slowly. "Not in the way you think." The words hung there, heavy and unspoken, until they weren't. I leaned forward to set my glass on the table, and as I did, I caught his gaze again, quiet, unreadable. I didn't flinch. I didn't move away. I just watched him watching me. We kissed. No one spoke after. No one needed to. We sat in the stillness like it had always been there, like it had been waiting quietly beneath all the breakfasts and polite silences. And then, just as quietly, he stood and walked out of the room. I sat there long after he was gone, fingers lightly grazing the rim of my glass. The warmth in my chest had nothing to do with the wine. It was something else, something terrifying and vivid and alive. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed with the covers pulled up to my chin, staring at the ceiling, trying to rewrite the memory. Trying to make it less than what it was. But it wouldn't shrink. It stayed large and luminous in my mind, stubborn in its clarity. I told myself it didn't mean anything. That it was a moment, a mistake. But I also knew what moments can become when no one stops them. In the morning, I put on a new blouse. Nothing dramatic, just something different. Something softer. I brushed my hair with more intention than usual, dabbed a little scent behind my ears. He was already at the kitchen table when I came down, his coffee halfway done. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge what had passed between us. But his eyes paused on me for just 1 second longer than they used to. And I knew we were both pretending now. Pretending that nothing had changed. But everything had. The next morning, I was up earlier than usual. Not by choice, but because something in me refused to let the night before settle. I kept replaying the moment on the couch like a scratched vinyl, the sensation of his lips lingering far longer than the act itself had lasted. I tried to dress the memory up as an accident, something driven by wine and misplaced loneliness, but I knew better. It was intentional. Quietly, undeniably intentional. The mirror in the hallway caught my reflection as I walked past. I didn't look any different, and yet everything inside me felt rearranged. I had tied my hair loosely that day, left it softer around the face. Not to invite anything, I told myself, just for me. I needed to feel different to believe I was still in control. I moved into the kitchen, where I found him already seated, flipping through a newspaper he wasn't really reading. The coffee was made. He had poured 2 cups. Mine was still steaming. That, more than anything, unsettled me. It meant he had expected me, timed it even. We didn't speak. Not for the first 10 minutes. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of paper and the clink of his spoon against ceramic. I pretended to focus on my cup, but in truth, my mind was nowhere near the kitchen. It was scattered, hovering over what had happened, trying to make sense of what I'd let begin. Eventually, he folded the paper and set it aside. I braced myself for something, an acknowledgement, a question, a plea. But it never came. Instead, he stood, rinsed his cup, and left the kitchen without a word. That, in itself, was an answer. The silence meant this wasn't over. I cleaned more than necessary that day. Dusted corners no one ever noticed. Rearranged spices, wiped cabinets inside and out. I needed movement to calm my hands. Stillness felt like permission for my mind to wander, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. After lunch, I went into the living room and sat by the window. The sunlight stretched across the floor in long strips, and the quiet hum of the neighborhood filled the air, distant dogs, passing cars, a lawnmower a few houses down. Normalcy, everywhere, except within me. He entered the room at some point, quietly, as he always did. I didn't hear him until he sat in the armchair across from mine. Our eyes met, and neither of us smiled. There was no need to pretend. The air between us wasn't innocent anymore. "I'll go into town later," he said, finally. "Need a few things." I nodded but didn't respond. "You need anything?" "No," I said quietly. "I'm fine." He stood again and disappeared down the hallway. I watched the space he left behind, as if it would offer some kind of resolution. It didn't. Later that afternoon, I found myself in the hallway outside his room. I wasn't sure why. I could have said I was checking for laundry or dusting, but the truth was simpler. I wanted to see the space that belonged to him. Understand it. Maybe understand him. His room was clean, minimalist, lived in but respectful. A few books on the nightstand, a framed photo of his late wife on the dresser. That surprised me. I'd assumed he kept it tucked away somewhere, too painful to see daily. But no, it stood there plainly, part of the furniture, part of him. I studied her face. She had kind eyes. Serene. The sort of face that didn't need to speak to be heard. I wondered if she had noticed the things I noticed now, the way he observed, how he listened before speaking, how stillness seemed to be his first language. I didn't belong in that room, but I couldn't leave just yet. I stepped back into the hallway when I heard the front door open and close. He had left for town, just as he said he would. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by guilt. I didn't want him to come back, and I also did. That contradiction followed me the rest of the day. Evening brought rain. Gentle at first, then heavier, until the sound of droplets tapping against the windows became the only noise in the house. I sat in the dining room, lights dimmed, a book open in front of me that I wasn't reading. I turned pages just to keep my hands busy. When he returned, I didn't hear him enter. Only noticed when the front door clicked shut and the air shifted. He passed through the room without saying anything, heading toward the kitchen. A moment later, I heard the soft chime of the microwave, the clink of a spoon stirring something. Tea, maybe. Soup. I couldn't tell. He came back a few minutes later with 2 mugs and set one down in front of me without a word. It was tea. Chamomile. The kind I usually made for myself when I couldn't sleep. He didn't ask if I wanted it. He just knew. We sat in silence for a while. Not tense, not heavy. Just quiet. I went by the old house, he said eventually. I looked up. Why? Had to drop something off to the neighbors. They're watching the backyard until we sell. You're selling it? He nodded slowly. There's no reason to keep it anymore. I wasn't sure why that struck me. Perhaps it was the finality in his voice. As if some chapter had been closed that afternoon, and this, whatever we were dancing around, had become the new reality. He looked down at his cup, then back up at me. His gaze was steady, not searching for permission, just meeting me exactly where I was. You look tired, he said. I didn't sleep. Neither did I. We didn't elaborate. We didn't have to. That night, I lay in bed longer than usual, the rain now a steady lull outside. The mug still sat on my nightstand, half empty. I hadn't touched it since he handed it to me. I thought about what I wanted. Not in vague terms. Not in the way we often do when we tell ourselves we just want to be seen or heard. I tried to name it. I wanted closeness. I wanted to feel again. Wanted to be acknowledged in a way that didn't vanish behind a screen or get lost in a business trip. My husband hadn't called that day. I hadn't expected him to. In the dark, I reached out for the pillow beside me and found it cold. There was no denying it anymore. The silence in this house wasn't just a result of grief or loss or time. It had a shape, a direction. And it was pulling us toward something we hadn't prepared for. The question wasn't whether it would happen again. It was whether we would try to stop it. The rain didn't stop the next morning. It had softened overnight into a quiet drizzle, the kind that clung to windows and made everything outside look smudged. I stood by the kitchen sink, staring at the backyard through the streaked glass, a dish towel in my hands though there were no dishes left to dry. The smell of coffee drifted through the air, but I hadn't poured myself a cup. My appetite had gone somewhere in the night and hadn't returned. He entered the kitchen without saying anything, his footsteps careful, unhurried. I could hear the slight creak in the floorboard by the pantry. He always stepped over it, but this time he didn't. I wondered if that meant something. Or maybe I was just noticing everything now, reading into silences and small sounds because there was no language yet for what existed between us. The kettle whistled softly. He reached over, turned off the burner, and poured hot water into 2 cups, dropping tea bags with a kind of quiet ritualism. We moved around each other like dancers, neither bumping nor touching, but always aware of where the other stood. I might take a walk later, he said eventually, placing 1 mug in front of me. In this weather? He shrugged. The air's cleaner when it rains. He left the mug and walked out of the room. I didn't follow. I sat down at the table and wrapped my hands around the cup. The warmth didn't reach my fingers. The tea tasted like memory, soft, unremarkable, but grounding in a way I couldn't explain. By mid-morning, the rain had slowed to a mist. I heard the front door open and close, followed by the click of his umbrella and the soft brush of his coat being lifted from the rack. I watched from the front window as he walked down the driveway and disappeared behind the hedges. A part of me wanted to stop him, to ask where he was going, but I didn't. I wasn't ready for what I might say if he turned and asked me to come with him. I busied myself with small tasks. Dusting picture frames, refolding towels in the linen closet, checking expiration dates in the pantry. All distractions. None of them held my attention. Eventually, I found myself back in the guest room. His room. I paused in the doorway, unsure if crossing that threshold without him there was crossing a different kind of line. But I entered anyway, slowly, reverently. The space smelled faintly of cedar and aftershave. His bed was neatly made, the corners tucked tightly, a book laid face down on the nightstand. The framed photograph of his wife still stood on the dresser. I walked toward it, studied her face again. She seemed younger in this one. Her hair was pulled back, her smile quiet. Not posed. Content. I touched the edge of the frame and felt a sudden guilt rise up in me. Not because of what had happened, but because of what was starting to happen inside me. This wasn't just a lapse, a mistake fueled by wine or timing. This was a shift. A slow unraveling. And it scared me more than anything. I turned and left the room, closing the door behind me as gently as I could. The sound still felt loud. Later, I took a walk through the neighborhood. The clouds had lifted slightly, the light returning in patches. I moved slowly, letting my feet find their own rhythm. The streets were quiet, the lawns wet, the leaves heavy with leftover rain. I passed the old park we used to visit when we first moved here. Back then, we'd come on weekends, my husband and I, holding hands and making plans for renovations, vacations, futures. Those plans felt distant now. Not erased, just filed away in a drawer we hadn't opened in years. When I returned, the house was warm again. He was in the kitchen, chopping herbs with deliberate precision, the smell of rosemary thick in the air. Something simmered on the stove, onions, maybe, and garlic. He didn't look up when I walked in, but I knew he heard me. "I hope you don't mind," he said. "I found some things in the fridge that needed using." I took off my shoes and stepped onto the tile. "No, it's fine." We moved around the kitchen without touching. I found plates, he stirred the pot. I set the table, he added spices. Everything about it felt normal, even though it wasn't. Dinner was quiet. The clinking of utensils filled the space between our glances. We didn't speak about anything important. Not about what had happened. Not about what hadn't. Just small things. The food. The weather. A news story on the radio. And in that silence, I found myself studying his hands, strong, veined, slow in their movements. I wondered if they had always moved like that, or if I was only noticing now. After we finished, I stood to clear the table. He reached for my plate at the same time I did, and our fingers brushed again. Not by accident. But not by design either. Just the kind of contact that happens when people are no longer pretending they don't notice each other. I didn't pull away right away. Neither did he. But eventually, I turned, carried the plates to the sink, and began washing them. He stayed nearby, drying with a towel, passing me each one as I finished. We worked like a team. An unspoken rhythm formed between us. There was comfort in that. And danger too. Later that night, I sat alone in the living room with the lights off. Just the glow from the hallway cast a faint amber hue across the rug. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and stared at nothing in particular. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. I heard his footsteps approach before I saw him. He didn't say anything. Just stood in the doorway, watching. I turned slightly toward him, but didn't move. Didn't invite. Didn't resist. "I'm going to bed," he said softly. I nodded. He lingered a moment longer, then disappeared down the hall. I sat there for what felt like hours. That night, I dreamed of water, endless, silent water stretching out in every direction. I was standing in the middle of it, fully clothed, the hem of my dress soaked and heavy. I wasn't drowning, but I wasn't moving either. When I woke, the room was still dark, but I could hear the wind picking up outside. A storm was coming. And I wasn't sure which part of me hoped it would pass. And which part hoped it would stay. The storm came sooner than I expected. By morning, the windows rattled gently, and wind pressed against the sides of the house with an impatient rhythm. I stood at the kitchen window, watching branches sway like they were reaching for something just out of grasp. The sky was a dull gray, and the light coming in felt tired, reluctant. I boiled water for coffee and moved around the kitchen slowly, aware of every step I took. Each motion felt deliberate now, like I was part of some slow unfolding I couldn't stop, even if I tried. I wasn't entirely sure whether I wanted to stop it. I heard his door open upstairs, the soft creak of old hinges followed by the familiar shuffle of slippered feet against hardwood. I didn't turn around when he entered the kitchen. Instead, I focused on the steam rising from the kettle, pretending the weather outside demanded more of my attention than the man standing behind me. He stopped just a step or two away from where I stood, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The tension wasn't sharp, it was soft, quiet, like the moment just before a leaf detaches from a tree. I poured 2 cups, placed them on the table, and sat down. He joined me a moment later, lowering himself into the chair across from mine with a quiet sigh. We sipped in silence. Not awkward. Not strained. Just aware. I looked at his hands again, resting calmly on the table, fingers curled loosely around the ceramic mug. There was something grounding about them, weathered, steady, unpretentious. I found myself comparing them to my husband's hands, always in motion, always holding a phone or typing a message or adjusting something with urgency. There was no urgency here. The silence was broken by the wind knocking something over on the porch, a flower pot, probably. We both turned our heads toward the sound but didn't get up to check. It could wait. After breakfast, we drifted into our own spaces. I took to dusting the bookshelves in the living room. He disappeared to the garage for a while. The radio murmured low in the background, classical music, a piano piece I couldn't name but recognized. The kind of music that filled the room without needing anything from you. Around midday, he reappeared in the living room doorway. I was sitting on the couch with a folded blanket in my lap, still pretending to straighten it for no real reason. "Do you want to come outside?" he asked. "Just for a few minutes." I glanced toward the window. "It's still raining." He nodded. "Just thought the air might help. Clear the noise." Something about the way he said it made me put the blanket down and follow. We stepped onto the covered porch, where the rain fell steadily just inches from where we stood. The sky above was low and pressing. The wind had calmed, but the world still felt unsettled. We stood side by side, watching the water run in narrow streams along the walkway, soaking into the cracks in the bricks. I folded my arms against the chill. "I used to love this kind of weather," I said. He looked over. "Used to?" It made me feel smaller. In a good way. Like the world was too big for any of my problems to matter. And now? Now it just makes me feel alone. We didn't speak after that. There was no need to. The wind carried our silence well. Back inside, he disappeared again, and I returned to the living room. I found an old photo album tucked beneath the TV cabinet, one we hadn't looked through in years. I brought it to the table and sat down, thumbing through the pages. There we were for birthdays, road trips, Christmases. My husband's arm always around my shoulder, always smiling for the camera. I stared at our frozen smiles, trying to remember what they had felt like when they were real. He entered the room quietly and paused when he saw what I was looking at. I didn't hide it. I left the album open and pushed it slightly toward him. "This one," I said, pointing to a picture of my husband and me standing in front of a cabin, "was taken 3 years ago. We went away for a weekend. It rained the whole time." He sat across from me and leaned in slightly. "You look happy." I studied the picture again. I was trying to be. He didn't ask any questions. Instead, he turned the page. There was a photo of all of us, my husband, me, his parents, taken in this very house, before she passed. We were standing in the garden. The roses were in bloom. His late wife had her arm looped through his, her expression gentle and amused. "She loved that dress," he said, tracing a finger over the image. I watched his hand, then his face. There was no sorrow in it. Only memory. That distinction mattered. We turned a few more pages before closing the book. I left it on the table and walked into the kitchen. I needed something to do with my hands. I began slicing vegetables for dinner, more out of habit than hunger. He joined me, as he often did now, and without a word, picked up the cutting board and helped. We worked quietly, comfortably, in rhythm. I could feel him beside me, present, aware, not pressing forward, not pulling away. When I reached over him to grab a sprig of thyme, our hands touched again. Lightly. We both paused. And then, we kissed. Nothing more. Nothing said. I stepped back and returned to the stove. He moved to rinse the dishes. The air in the room had shifted again, but it wasn't heavy. It was warm. Full. Dinner was ready in silence, served in silence, eaten with calmness neither of us pretended to understand. There was no apology in our glances. No fear. Only the acknowledgement that we had crossed another invisible line, and that there was no going back across it. Later, when the dishes were done and the lights dimmed, I stood at the kitchen window again. The rain had slowed to a mist. The porch light cast a golden circle just beyond the glass. I pressed my fingertips to the cool surface and listened to the house breathe. Somewhere behind me, he was still moving, upstairs, maybe closing a door, maybe settling into the silence of his own thoughts. I remained there long after the mist faded. The glass fogged under my breath. I wasn't waiting for anything. I just wasn't ready to stop feeling. The days had begun to blend together. Not because nothing was happening, but because everything was happening so quietly. There was no confrontation, no dramatic turning point, no open declarations or grand refusals, only small shifts, passing looks, lingering pauses. Each day became a thin layer added to the one before it, and the weight of them was starting to settle into my bones. I woke early that morning, even before the sky had begun to lighten. The house was still, cocooned in pre-dawn silence. I didn't get up right away. I lay in bed with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling, feeling the pull of something I couldn't quite name. Not guilt. Not yet. But a kind of tension, like I had stepped just far enough into something dangerous to no longer pretend I hadn't. When I finally rose, I moved through the house like a shadow, careful not to wake anyone. I boiled water for tea instead of coffee, something softer, gentler. I stood by the window with my hands around the mug, watching the fog hang low over the yard. It made everything outside look like it was holding its breath. Eventually, I heard the stairs creak. I didn't turn. I knew it was him. I knew it from the weight of his footsteps, slower than my husband's, but more deliberate. He didn't say anything as he entered the kitchen. He just moved beside me and reached for his own mug. We stood like that for several minutes, side by side, watching the fog slowly dissolve into daylight. There was no urgency between us, no awkwardness either. We had passed that point. Now it was only quiet awareness of what had happened, of what hadn't, of everything suspended in between. Later, I went about my usual chores. I changed the sheets in the guest room, folded towels, refilled the soap dispensers. I found comfort in the routine, in the repetition of familiar motions. It gave me the illusion of control, even if I knew better. When I passed the hallway, I saw the door to his room slightly ajar. I paused, glanced inside. It looked exactly the same, neat, simple, undisturbed. The bed was made. The curtains were pulled back just enough to let in the morning light. On the dresser, beside the photo of his wife, was a folded piece of paper. A letter, maybe. Or just a note to himself. I didn't step inside to find out. After lunch, I went for a walk. The fog had lifted, but the sky remained overcast. I didn't take a path or set a destination. I just moved, letting my feet decide for me. The air was cool, and the wind carried the faint smell of damp earth and fallen leaves. It reminded me of childhood, of quiet walks with my mother, of Sunday afternoons when time moved slowly and nothing felt urgent. When I returned, he was sitting in the living room, reading. I nodded as I passed, and he nodded back. Nothing more. I went upstairs to change, then busied myself in the kitchen. I started preparing dinner earlier than usual, chopping vegetables slowly, savoring the rhythm of the blade against the cutting board. He joined me eventually, offering to help without words. He reached for the onions and began peeling, his movements unhurried. We worked in silence, occasionally exchanging glances, but never words. The quiet was its own kind of language now, one that didn't demand explanation or permission. At one point, our hands brushed again, and neither of us flinched. We didn't lean into it, but we didn't pull away either. It was simply acknowledged, a truth that no longer needed hiding. Dinner was simple: roasted vegetables, lentil soup, warm bread. We ate slowly, like the food mattered less than the presence of someone else at the table. The radio played something soft in the background, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. Afterward, I cleaned the kitchen while he dried the dishes. We didn't speak, but I could feel his presence behind me, steady and quiet. When we finished, I turned off the lights, and we moved together into the living room, each settling into our usual seats. The silence stretched comfortably between us, filled only by the soft hum of the heater and the occasional rustle of a turning page. I picked up a magazine but didn't read it. I just held it in my lap, my mind elsewhere. At some point, he looked up from his book and met my eyes. There was no question in his gaze. No expectation. Just presence. I stood slowly and walked toward the hallway. I didn't look back to see if he followed. I paused outside his room, my hand resting lightly on the doorframe. The hallway light cast a pale glow across the floor. I could hear the faint creak of his chair as he rose. A few moments later, I felt his presence behind me. Neither of us said a word. We spent the night together. The next morning, I woke before the sun again. I lay in bed with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The house was still, but I didn't feel alone. Not in the way I used to. I rose quietly and went downstairs to make tea. The fog had returned, heavier this time. It blanketed the yard, wrapped itself around the trees, muted the world. As I stood by the window, hands wrapped around a warm mug, I knew that nothing could go back to what it had been. Not because of what we had done, but because of what it had revealed about me, about the life I'd been living, about the quiet hunger that had been growing inside me for years. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't try to run from that truth. I let it sit beside me in the silence, like a long-forgotten companion finally acknowledged. The next day arrived with an eerie stillness. The house felt different, not in how it looked or sounded, but in how it carried the weight of what had passed between us. Nothing had been spoken aloud, but the walls knew. The floorboards. Even the quiet way the curtains fluttered in the morning breeze felt changed. I moved slowly that morning, deliberately, as if each motion had to be considered. I washed my face longer than usual, brushed my hair with more care. I didn't want to dress up or make myself noticeable. In fact, I found myself choosing the simplest clothes I owned, loose, neutral, soft. There was something in me that wanted to hide, even as another part ached to be seen. Downstairs, he was already at the table, sipping tea and reading the newspaper like nothing had happened. There was no trace of tension in his posture, no pause when he turned the page, no shift in tone when he greeted me. I almost resented that. But only for a moment. Then I realized it was easier this way, for both of us. I poured my tea and sat across from him. The sound of the spoon clinking against the mug was louder than usual in the silence. I tried to read the headline on the front page he held, but my eyes wouldn't focus. My mind was too full of fragments. Moments. Questions I didn't know how to form, let alone answer. He looked up briefly, offered a quiet smile, then went back to reading. I wanted to say something. I wanted to ask, what now? But the words caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. So I said nothing. We finished breakfast in silence, the kind that wasn't cold but wasn't warm either. It was transitional. Like the moment between inhale and exhale. The rest of the morning passed in fragments. I watered the plants. He mended a loose hinge on one of the kitchen cabinet doors. I changed the bedding in the master bedroom. Not because it needed changing, but because I needed something to do with my hands. It was while folding the sheets that I heard the car pull into the driveway. My heart stopped. I moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see. It was my husband. He wasn't supposed to return until the following day. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I smoothed my blouse, checked my reflection in the hallway mirror, then made my way downstairs, careful not to rush. I passed him, my father-in-law, in the hallway. He met my eyes for the briefest second, a flicker of recognition in his expression. Then he stepped aside. The door opened, and my husband walked in with a tired smile, suitcase in one hand, phone in the other. He leaned in to kiss my cheek, and I let him. His scent, once familiar, now felt unfamiliar. Sharp. Foreign. I noticed how long he lingered, as if testing whether I would pull away. Got back early, he said, setting down his bag. I see that, I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. He looked around. Everything okay? I nodded, and he didn't press. He moved into the kitchen, where his father was now rinsing out his mug. They exchanged a brief greeting, warm, if distant, and then settled into a casual conversation about traffic and weather. The kind of talk that serves as insulation from anything deeper. I stood at the threshold, listening, observing. I felt like a guest in my own home. Like someone waiting for a signal to re-enter her own life. The rest of the day unfolded with careful formality. My husband unpacked, checked emails, made 2 phone calls. I cooked something simple, chicken and rice, steamed vegetables, and we all sat down to eat as if nothing in the structure had shifted. As if the foundation hadn't cracked while no one was looking. I watched their interaction carefully. My husband didn't seem to notice anything. He was distracted, tired. He asked about errands, thanked me for folding his laundry, mentioned a colleague's retirement party. His father said little, offering polite nods and short answers. I kept my voice measured, neutral, like I was speaking a language that didn't belong to me. After dinner, my husband retreated to the living room with his laptop. He sat on the couch, typing, headphones on. I cleared the dishes while my father-in-law dried them. We moved around each other with the precision of people who had learned to navigate a space without touching. At one point, I handed him a plate. Our fingers brushed. Just slightly. But even that was too much. He looked at me, just once, and I knew we both felt it, the shift, the presence of something unspoken pressing against the air between us. It was heavier now. Riskier. I turned back to the sink. That night, I lay in bed beside my husband, listening to the sound of him breathing. Even in sleep, he was distant. I could feel the space between our bodies like a canyon. And yet, there was no blame in me. Only clarity. I turned onto my side, facing away from him. My eyes traced the outline of the window, the moonlight soft through the curtains. I thought about the days that had passed, the choices I had made, and the quiet unraveling of a woman who had once been so sure of her place in the world. I had changed. Not because of him, not entirely. But because something in me had been asleep for years. And now it was awake. In the dark, I heard a floorboard creak somewhere down the hall. It didn't come closer. It stopped, just long enough for me to know it had been there. Then silence returned. The next morning, I rose early, careful not to wake my husband. I moved through the house softly, preparing coffee and toast. I opened windows, letting in the cool morning air. It smelled like wet grass and something else, something clean. He entered the kitchen a few minutes later, my father-in-law, eyes tired but calm. We didn't speak. I handed him a cup of coffee, and he took it. Our hands didn't touch this time. The silence between us was no longer electric. It was something else now. Measured. Watchful. Waiting. We were no longer moving forward. But we hadn't moved back either. We were standing still, at the edge of a line we couldn't uncross. It took 3 days for the silence to grow into something I could no longer ignore. Not the silence between me and him, my father-in-law, but the silence inside me, where all the questions used to echo, now filled with an unsteady calm. A calm that wasn't peace, but avoidance. I knew it. I felt it in the way I moved, in the way I watched my husband drink his coffee in the morning without seeing me. In the way I responded to his questions with just enough energy to keep things from tipping. He didn't suspect. Not really. If there was a pause in his voice or a narrowing of his gaze, it was likely about work or fatigue. He didn't study me closely, didn't search for inconsistencies in my answers. His days were occupied, and his nights were quiet. He slept easily. I didn't. The days had resumed their rhythm. Familiar routines, subtle pauses, predictable gestures. But underneath that rhythm, something else pulsed. A discomfort I couldn't push away. It lived in the way I avoided mirrors, in how my hand hesitated before brushing against his in the kitchen, in how I carefully measured every moment I spent alone in a room with one or the other. On the 4th morning, I was cleaning out a drawer in the hallway cabinet, one of those drawers filled with old keys, rubber bands, batteries that probably no longer worked. It was a meaningless task, but it gave my hands something to do. As I sifted through paper clips and expired coupons, I found a photo tucked between 2 folded instruction manuals. It was printed on matte paper. Not glossy. Not recent. I held it carefully, dust clinging to the edges. It showed the backyard, from some spring years ago. The rose bushes were in bloom, and someone had laid out a picnic blanket. My husband was there, seated with a drink in hand, squinting into the sun. Next to him, closer than I remembered, was me. I was laughing. My head was tilted back slightly, and one of his arms was resting behind me on the grass. But it wasn't his. It was his father's. And even though nothing in the photo looked inappropriate, even though no one who saw it would think twice about it, I knew. I didn't remember the moment the picture was taken. I didn't remember that afternoon. But the intimacy in it, the casual proximity, the familiarity in the way our bodies leaned toward each other, it was undeniable. Not romantic. Not explicit. But too close. I turned the photo over. There was no date. No handwriting. Just a faint crease in the corner. I stared at it longer than I meant to, then folded it into a paper towel and slipped it into my pocket. I didn't know why I didn't just put it back. Later that afternoon, I found my husband in the garage. He was moving things around, reorganizing shelves, preparing for a home project he'd been putting off for months. He turned as I stepped in. Looking for something? I hesitated. Just wanted to see what you were doing. He wiped his hands on a rag. Trying to get this mess under control. Half the stuff in here is probably junk. He gestured toward a dusty box. You know we still have decorations from our first apartment? I nodded, but my mind was still on the photo. Do you need help? I asked, my voice quiet. He looked at me for a moment, then shook his head. Nah. Just keeping busy. You okay? That question. It came so simply, so gently, and yet it struck something in me. I forced a smile. Just restless. He nodded like he understood, but he didn't press. He turned back to the shelves, and I slipped out of the garage, returning to the kitchen where the photo still sat in my pocket like a small, dangerous secret. That evening, after dinner, I excused myself early. My husband was on a call in the office. His father was reading again, seated by the lamp in the corner of the living room, glasses low on his nose. As I passed him, I slowed just slightly. I need to speak with you, I said, barely above a whisper. He looked up, nodded once, then returned to his book. I waited until the house was quiet. Then I found him in the hallway, near the stairs. The light was low, the air between us still. I handed him the folded paper towel. He opened it carefully, stared at the photo, then at me. No expression crossed his face. He held it delicately, as if it might tear. Where did you find it? He asked. In the drawer. He nodded slowly, then looked down at the image again. Do you remember this? I asked. He took a moment. No. But it looks familiar. Do you think he will? His silence was answer enough. I took the photo back and, without thinking, tore it in half. He didn't stop me. He didn't say anything. I turned and walked away. That night, I lay awake while my husband slept beside me. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every word, every glance, every breath I had held inside for too long. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I simply existed in the discomfort of my own choices. Around midnight, I got out of bed and walked to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water and stood by the sink, letting the silence wrap around me like a thin coat. Behind me, I heard soft footsteps. He stopped a few feet away, said nothing. I didn't turn. I'm sorry, he said eventually. I closed my eyes. Don't be. I should go, he said after a pause. I turned then. Where? I don't know. Maybe back to the old house. Just for a while. I nodded, not because I wanted him to, but but because I couldn't see another way. We stood in silence, the distance between us a chasm that hadn't been there a week ago. He stepped back. "Good night." And then he disappeared down the hallway. I remained in the kitchen, the glass still full in my hand, untouched. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, the guest room door was closed. And everything felt heavier. The morning felt colder than usual. There wasn't any real change in the temperature, but something about the air inside the house had shifted. Even the light through the windows seemed thinner, more reluctant. I wrapped a sweater around myself and stood in the hallway, staring at the closed guest room door. It was still. Quiet. I didn't knock. I didn't want to hear nothing on the other side. I moved past it, down the stairs, and into the kitchen. The kettle was still warm from the last use, though no one else had been up yet. I stood beside it, not making tea, just listening to the low hum of the appliances and the distant creak of the house settling into the morning. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so unsure of my place in my own home. Everything I touched felt fragile, every plate, every drawer, every doorknob. Even the floorboards beneath my feet, which I used to walk across without thinking, now felt like they might give way if I stepped too hard. My husband entered the kitchen not long after. He looked tired but focused, already dressed for the day, with his phone in one hand and a distracted expression on his face. He greeted me with a brief kiss on the cheek, one that landed a little too far back, closer to my ear. I wondered if he noticed. I wondered if he cared. "I've got a meeting in 20, he said, pouring himself coffee. "Are you using the car today?" I shook my head. "No. I'll be home." "Okay, good. I might need to swing by the office later." He didn't wait for a reply. He was already moving through the motions of his morning. Toast. Emails. Tying his shoes by the door. I wanted to ask him something, anything, to break the surface of our quiet routine, but the words sat heavy in my mouth and refused to form. So instead, I asked the only thing I could manage. "Did you sleep okay?" He glanced up, surprised by the question. "Yeah. You?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Fine." He smiled faintly, then reached for his bag. "I'll be in the office upstairs if you need me." And then he was gone. Again. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking out the window at the yard. The roses were wilting now. Their color had faded, the petals sagging and darkened. I thought about the photo I had torn in half. I thought about what it had meant, what it hadn't. By late morning, I noticed the guest room door still hadn't opened. I checked my phone, no new messages. I knocked once, gently, almost hoping he wouldn't answer. There was a rustle, then footsteps. He opened the door a crack and looked at me, his expression unreadable. "I just wanted to check if you're okay," I said quietly. He nodded once. "I'm packing." I didn't say anything for a moment. I didn't know what to say. "I understand," I managed. He looked at me for a beat longer. "Do you?" I wasn't sure how to answer. "It's better this way." "For whom?" The question caught me off guard. I swallowed, then stepped back. "You'll let us know when you're ready to leave." He nodded and closed the door again. I walked back downstairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The rest of the day passed in fragments. My husband worked upstairs. I cleaned the bathroom. Washed a load of towels. Answered an email about a doctor's appointment. All the while, I was aware of the closed door above me. A space within a space. A silence that had shape and presence in mass. By evening, he came down with 2 bags packed, neat, precise, like he had known this moment would come long before I did. My husband was in the backyard watering plants when he passed through the kitchen. Our eyes met for a moment, and he paused. "I'll call when I'm settled," he said. I nodded. "Thank you," he added, softer. "For letting me stay." I wanted to laugh at the politeness of it. Like he had been a guest here. Like the rooms didn't remember more. Instead, I nodded again. He looked like he might say more, but then he turned and walked out the door, quiet and unceremonious. I didn't watch him leave. I didn't go to the window or linger in the hallway. I just stood in the kitchen, hands pressed flat against the counter, waiting for the air to settle. My husband came inside a few minutes later, setting down the hose and rubbing his hands on his pants. "Was that Dad?" "Yes," I said. "He's going back to the old house for a while." "Did he say why?" "He said he needed space." He nodded, unconcerned. "Probably good for him. Too many memories in this place." He said it with such detachment, such casual understanding, and for a moment I envied him. That ability to move on without looking back. That ease with which he accepted half-truths and unfinished conversations. We ate dinner in silence. Watched TV. Went to bed at the usual time. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of his breathing beside me. I thought about the photo I had destroyed. The nights I had spent pretending not to feel. The mornings filled with silence so thick it made my bones ache. I thought about what I had done. About what I hadn't. And I realized something that both comforted and terrified me. The worst part wasn't the betrayal. It wasn't even the secret. It was that no one had noticed. No one had ever truly seen me. And maybe that's what had started it all. Not passion. Not grief. Just the unbearable ache of invisibility. I closed my eyes and listened to the nothingness. The room. The man beside me. The space where another had once stood. And I let it all settle into me, piece by piece, until the quiet wasn't empty anymore, just true.